My name's Dale Renfro, 43 years old. Been with the Harney County Sheriff's Office in southeastern Oregon for going on 18 years now. Before that, I did 4 years with the Army. 11B Infantry, did a tour in Afghanistan. Thought I'd seen the worst a man could see. I was wrong. The night I'm telling you about was November 9th, 2 years back. I'd picked up an extra shift because my wife Linda was visiting her sister in Boise, and the house felt too quiet. Harney County's the biggest county in Oregon by landmass. Bigger than some whole states, but we've got maybe 7,000 people spread across it. Mostly ranches, BLM land, high desert that turns mean when the sun goes down. I was running patrol on Highway 205 south of Burns. Just me and the sagebrush and about 60 miles of nothing in either direction. Dispatch that night was Carla Mendez. Good woman, sharp, been doing it longer than I've been wearing the badge. Around 2,300 hours, she patched through a call from a rancher named Virgil Taskey, lived about 12 miles off the main road, down a gravel two-track. Said someone was standing at the edge of his property, just standing there in the dark, wouldn't respond when he called out. I knew Virgil, 70-something, lived alone since his wife passed, kept maybe 300 head of cattle and a couple of dogs that were meaner than the weather. Wasn't like him to call unless something was genuinely wrong. I turned off 205 onto the gravel and radioed my position. Carla confirmed and said she'd check back in 20. My dash cam timestamp read 23:17 when I started down that road. The night was clear, stars thick as spilled salt, temperature hovering around 28 degrees. High desert gets cold fast once the sun drops. My headlights carved through the dark, and the sagebrush threw long shadows that moved like things crawling away from the light. Took me about 15 minutes to reach Virgil's place. His porch light was on, and I could see him standing in the doorway with a rifle cradled in his arms. I parked, hit my spotlight, swept it across the property line where he'd indicated. Nothing. Just fence posts and dead grass and the black outline of the rim rock maybe half a mile out. I stepped out, hand on my service weapon out of habit, and called out to Virgil. He came down off the porch slow, moving like a man who'd seen something that made his bones ache. He told me the figure had been standing by the southeast corner of his fence for over an hour. Just standing. Hadn't moved when he turned on the floodlights. Hadn't moved when he fired a warning shot into the air. His dogs, a pair of Australian shepherds that would take on coyotes without thinking twice, wouldn't go near the fence. They just sat on the porch whining, hackles up, staring. When I asked him what the figure looked like, Virgil got quiet, said it looked like his son, Marcus. Marcus Taskett died in a car accident outside Bend in 2019. I swept my flashlight across the fence line again, walked the perimeter with Virgil hanging back. Found nothing, no footprints, no disturbance in the frost that was starting to form on the grass. Told Virgil it might have been a drifter, maybe someone from the homeless camp that sets up sometimes near the highway. He just shook his head, said he knew what his son looked like, even at 200 yards in the dark. I stayed another 20 minutes, checked his outbuildings, made sure everything was secure. Radioed Carla that the situation was code 4, unfounded, probably a trick of the light. I was maybe 3 miles back down the gravel road when my radio started acting up. Static at first, then what sounded like voices bleeding through, overlapping. Like 2 or 3 people talking at once. I tried to raise Carla but got nothing back. Figured it was the terrain. We get dead spots all over the county where the rim rock blocks the signal. Then my headlights flickered. Once, twice, then went completely dark for maybe 2 seconds. When they came back on, there was a man standing in the middle of the road about 40 yards ahead. I hit the brakes hard enough to lock up the wheels, felt the back end slide on the gravel, came to a stop maybe 10 yards from him. He was just standing there facing me, arms at his sides, wearing what looked like ranch clothes, jeans, and a canvas jacket, but something was wrong with his proportions. His arms were too long, hung past his knees. His head was tilted at an angle that would have been impossible for anyone with a normal spine. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine running, high beams cutting through the dark. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe far as I could tell. My hand was on my weapon, but something in me, some old instinct from Afghanistan maybe, told me that drawing on this thing would be the worst mistake I ever made. Instead, I reached for my radio and tried Carla again. This time I got a response, but it wasn't Carla's voice. It was a man's voice, flat and emotionless, and it said my name. Just my name, over and over. Dale Renfro, Dale Renfro, Dale Renfro. I dropped the radio like it burned me. When I looked back at the road, the figure was gone. Not walked away, not retreated into the sagebrush. Gone, like he'd never been there. I sat in that truck for a full minute, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Then I drove. I drove faster than I should have on that gravel, fishtailing around curves, and I didn't slow down until I hit the pavement of 205. My radio came back to normal about a mile from the highway. Carla's voice, clear as day, asking for my status. I told her I was en route back to Burns, code 4. She said she'd been trying to reach me for the last 15 minutes, but got nothing but dead air. I didn't tell her what I saw. I still haven't told anyone the full truth until now. When I got back to the station, I pulled my dash cam footage. The timestamp showed a gap. From 23:47 to 0:12, 25 minutes, the footage was just black. Not corrupted, not static. Black, like someone had put a lens cap over the camera. My body cam, which I'd activated when I got out at Virgil's place, showed the same thing. Black from the moment I left Virgil's driveway until I hit the highway. I drove back out to Virgil's place 3 days later, during the day, just to check on him. The house was empty, his truck was there, his dogs were there, half-starved and wild-eyed. But Virgil was gone. We searched for 2 weeks. BLM, SR teams, tracking dogs. Even got a helicopter from the National Guard. Never found a trace. The official report says he wandered off, possibly disoriented, possibly early-stage dementia. Case went cold. I put in for a transfer to desk duty 6 months later. I don't do night patrols anymore. I can't. Because sometimes, when I'm driving home after a late shift, I swear I see a figure standing at the edge of my property. Arms too long, head at the wrong angle, just standing there in the dark. Story 2. The name's Mariella Vance. I'm 31, been a deputy with the Swain County Sheriff's Office in Western North Carolina for 6 years. Before that, I worked search and rescue with the Forest Service, knew these mountains better than most. Thought I understood what kind of things lived in them. I grew up in Bryson City, watched the tourists come and go every summer, hiked every trail in the Smokies before I was old enough to drive. The night I'm about to describe happened last October, right after the first hard frost. I was covering for Deputy Bill Harrigan, who'd taken leave because his father was dying in Asheville. It was supposed to be a quiet shift. Nobody ever says that anymore, not after what happened. The call came in around 0130 hours from Fontana Village, a little tourist community at the edge of Fontana Lake. An elderly woman named Eunice Ponder reported sounds coming from the old Darnell homestead, a place that had been abandoned since the TVA flooded the valley back in the 40s. The Darnell property sat on a ridge above the waterline, one of the few original homesteads that survived the reservoir. Nobody lived there in decades. Eunice said she heard singing, a woman's voice drifting down from the ridge. Said it sounded like hymns her grandmother used to sing. The old shaped note kind they don't do anymore except at memorial singings. I took the call myself, radio dispatch that I was en route. The dispatcher that night was a kid named Travis Ledford, maybe 22, still green enough that he called me ma'am instead of deputy. I drove up the mountain road past the dam, past the turnoff for the Appalachian Trail, until I hit the gravel track that led to the Darnell property. My headlights caught fog rolling off the lake, thick and white, moving up the slopes like something alive. The homestead was exactly what you'd expect. Collapsing cabin, stone chimney still standing, kudzu eating everything that wasn't rock or rotten wood. I parked at the edge of the clearing and killed the engine. For a minute there was nothing, just the fog and the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it, a woman's voice, high and clear, singing something I couldn't quite make out. The tune was familiar in the way old things are familiar, like a memory you inherited from someone who died before you were born. I radioed Travis that I was going in on foot, requested he note the time for the log. 0147 hours. grabbed my flashlight and my weapon, though I didn't draw it, and started toward the cabin. The singing was coming from inside. I announced myself, standard procedure, voice loud enough to carry. Swain County Sheriff's Office, make yourself known. The singing stopped, just stopped, mid-note like someone had hit pause on a recording. I cleared the doorway, swept the inside with my light. Nothing. Rotted floorboards, a collapsed bed frame in one corner, what might have been a cook stove rusted down to lace. No footprints in the dust, no sign anyone had been in there for years. I was about to radio Travis that the scene was clear when I heard breathing behind me. Close, too close. I spun around and there was a woman standing in the doorway. She was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in a museum, all faded calico and hand stitching. Her hair was long and dark and wet, hanging in ropes around her face. Her skin was the color of old paper, and her eyes were wrong. Not the color was just brown, ordinary brown. It was the way she looked at me, like I was something she'd been waiting a very long time to see. She said my grandmother's name, just said it, flat and conversational, like she was picking up a conversation we'd been having. Opal Vance. My grandmother died in 1987, before I was born. I never knew her, but this woman said her name like she'd just seen her yesterday, said it with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. I told her to stay where she was, reached for my radio. The woman smiled, and there was nothing behind it. No warmth, no malice, just the mechanical movement of muscles that remembered what a smile was supposed to look like. She asked if Opal had ever told me about the water, about what was underneath it, about all the people who never left when the valley flooded. I backed up, stumbled over the collapsed bed frame, caught myself on the wall. When I looked up, she was gone, just gone. I cleared the cabin 3 times, swept every corner, checked outside, nothing. No footprints in the mud, no disturbance in the fog. I radioed Travis and told him I needed backup, gave him my location, tried to keep my voice steady. He said Deputy Marcus Ware was 20 minutes out. Those 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat in my cruiser with the doors locked and the engine running, watching the fog move around the cabin. Twice I thought I saw shapes in it, figures standing at the edge of the clearing. But every time I turned my spotlight on them, there was nothing there. My radio kept cutting in and out, fragments of voices that didn't sound like Travis or dispatch. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Marcus arrived at 0223 hours. Solid guy, 15 years on the job, not the type to spook easily. I told him what I'd seen or tried to, and he didn't laugh or dismiss it, just nodded and suggested we do a full perimeter check together. We swept the property with flashlights, found nothing unusual except for one thing. At the back of the cabin, half buried in the kudzu, there was a stone marker. I'd missed it on my first pass. Marcus cleared away the vines, and we read the inscription by flashlight. Eunice Darnell, born 1919, drowned 1941. Eunice Darnell, the same first name as the woman who'd called in the complaint. Eunice Ponder. I radioed Travis, asked him to verify the caller's information. He came back a few minutes later, sounding confused, said there was no Eunice Ponder listed in Fontana Village, no Ponder family at all. The call had come from a disconnected number. Marcus and I stood in that clearing for a long time, fog moving around us, neither of us saying what we were both thinking. Finally, he suggested we head back, file the report as an unfounded disturbance, and never speak of it again. I agreed. But as we were walking to our vehicles, Marcus stopped dead, staring at something behind me. I turned and there she was, the woman from the cabin, standing at the edge of the tree line, dress dripping water that pooled around her bare feet, eyes fixed on something beyond us. She raised one hand and pointed toward the lake. Then she opened her mouth and sang. One note, long and low, a note that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the fog and the trees and the water below. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The note held for what felt like minutes, vibrating in my chest, in my teeth, in the hollow spaces behind my eyes. Then it stopped and she was gone, and Marcus was shaking me, asking if I was okay, and I realized I'd been standing there, frozen, for almost 4 minutes. We left, drove back to the station without speaking, filed our reports separately. His version mentions a possible trespasser, possible mental health crisis, no contact made. Mine says the same. Neither of us put down what really happened. I went back to that property once, in daylight, 3 weeks later. The stone marker was still there, but something had been added to it. Fresh flowers, white lilies, arranged in a careful circle around the base. There are no white lilies native to that ridge. There's no way someone could have gotten up there without leaving tracks. The grave had been tended for the first time in 80 years, and whoever did it wasn't anyone from this side of the water. I still work for Swain County, still drive past Fontana Lake on patrol, but I don't take calls from the village anymore. And some nights when the fog rolls in thick off the water, I hear singing drifting down from the ridges. Old hymns, shape note style, sung by voices that should have been silent decades ago. Story 3. I'm Theodore Castillo, 38, served 11 years with the Weston County Sheriff's Department in northeastern Wyoming. Grew up in Newcastle, left for Cheyenne when I was 18, came back at 27 after my father got sick and someone needed to look after the family ranch. Joined the department because it was steady work and because I'd always wanted to do something that mattered. The night I'm going to tell you about was this past February, middle of winter, snow coming down sideways and the temperature sitting at 8 below zero before wind chill. I was the only unit on patrol because Deputy Jensen had called in sick and nobody wanted to drive in from Sundance to cover. The call came in at 0312 hours from a trucker on Highway 16 near the Beaver Creek crossing. He reported a man walking along the shoulder of the road wearing nothing but jeans and a t-shirt, no coat, no hat, no gloves, walking east toward Newcastle. Trucker said the man didn't respond when he honked, didn't even turn his head, just kept walking at a steady pace like he was on his way to church. Given the temperature, this was a medical emergency. Hypothermia, frostbite, possible mental health crisis. I hit my lights and headed east. Dispatch that night was Helen Brinkley. Been doing the job since before I was born. Voice like gravel and honey mixed together. She ran the plate on the trucker's semi, confirmed his identity, asked if I wanted additional units. I told her to stand by, I'd assess the situation and call for backup if needed. The roads were bad, ice under the snow, and I didn't want anyone else out there unless absolutely necessary. I found the man about 6 miles west of town, right where the trucker said he'd be. He was walking along the shoulder with a gait that was too steady, too mechanical for someone who should have been hypothermic. I pulled up alongside him, rolled down my window, identified myself. He didn't respond, didn't turn, just kept walking. I got out of the vehicle, approached him from behind, announced myself again. "Sir, Weston County Sheriff's Department, I need you to stop and talk to me." He stopped. Just stopped, mid-stride, 1 foot raised off the ground. Held that position for maybe 3 seconds, long enough to make every hair on my neck stand up, then slowly lowered his foot and turned to face me, wanked on. The first thing I noticed was that he wasn't shivering. 8 below zero, wind blowing hard enough to cut through my insulated jacket, and this man was standing there in a t-shirt like it was a spring day. The second thing I noticed was his face. I knew him. Everyone in Newcastle knew him. His name was Earl Sutton, and he'd been missing for 6 years. Walked into the Black Hills one November morning and never came back. Search parties went out for weeks. Found his truck at a trailhead, found some of his gear scattered along a game trail, but never found Earl. Eventually, they called it exposure, animal predation. Another tragedy in a county that had seen too many. Earl Sutton was standing in front of me, looking exactly the same as he had the day he disappeared. Not a day older, not frostbitten, not weathered, nothing. Just Earl, 43 years old when he vanished. 43 years old now, staring at me with eyes that didn't quite track right. I asked him his name. He smiled, slow and wrong, like someone who'd learned to smile from watching videos with the sound off. He said Earl, just Earl. No last name, no elaboration. I asked him where he'd been, and he tilted his head to one side, far enough that I could hear something click in his neck, and said underneath, I radioed Helen, told her I had a 1057 possible missing person located, and gave her my position. She came back almost immediately, voice sharp with concern. She asked me to repeat the name. I did. There was a long pause, longer than Helen ever paused, and then she said, Theodore, Earl Sutton's remains were identified 2 years ago. They found bones in a ravine near Inyankar. Dental records confirmed it. No, I looked at the man standing in front of me. He was still smiling that wrong smile, still not shivering, still watching me with eyes that seemed to look through me instead of at me. I asked him again where he'd been. He took a step toward me, just one step, and the smell hit me. Cold and wet and rotten, like meat that's been sitting in a freezer for years and just started to thaw. He said underneath. They're all underneath. You'll be underneath too, Theodore. He knew my name. I hadn't told him my name. I drew my weapon. Standard procedure for a threat assessment, years of training taking over. I ordered him to get on the ground, hands where I could see them. He didn't move, just stood there, swaying slightly in the wind, smile fixed on his face like something painted. I repeated the command. He took another step toward me. Then the wind changed direction and brought more of that smell, and with it came something else. Voices, faint, distant, carried on the wind. Not words I could make out, just sounds, rhythmic and low, like chanting or singing. Coming from the hills to the north, coming from the direction Earl had been walking away from. I backed toward my vehicle, weapons still drawn, and ordered Earl to stay where he was. He didn't follow, just watched me, head still tilted at that wrong angle, smile still fixed. I got into my cruiser, locked the doors, and radioed Helen for immediate backup. Told her to send everyone available. She asked what was happening. I couldn't answer, because when I looked in my rearview mirror, Earl was standing directly behind my vehicle, standing against the back bumper, face pressed to the rear window, breath fogging the glass. But the fog spelled something. Letters backwards, written in condensation that shouldn't have formed from breath that cold. The word was below. I hit the gas, fishtailed on the ice, nearly went into the ditch. Got the vehicle under control and drove. Didn't look back, didn't stop until I was inside the station in Newcastle, sitting in the break room with my hands shaking too hard to hold a coffee cup. Helen had called in Deputy Maria Garza from Sundance and Sergeant Tom Bird from Moorcroft. They arrived within the hour, found nothing on Highway 16. No footprints in the snow, no sign anyone had been walking that road. My dash cam footage showed me pulling over, getting out, talking to empty air, drawing my weapon on nothing, then getting back in and driving away. 23 minutes of me responding to something that wasn't there. But my body cam told a different story. The body cam showed Earl, showed his face, his smile, the way he moved, showed him standing behind my vehicle at the end, face pressed to the glass, showed the word in the fog. The audio picked up his voice, flat and wrong, saying underneath over and over. The footage was time-stamped and geotagged and completely impossible. Maria and Tom watched it with me. Nobody said anything for a long time. Finally, Tom, who's been in law enforcement longer than I've been alive, suggested we file the report as a medical emergency response. Unfounded, subject not located. He suggested the body cam footage be listed as a technical malfunction. Maria agreed. Helen, who'd been listening from dispatch, agreed too. I should have fought it, should have demanded an investigation, should have pushed for answers. But I knew somewhere in the part of me that still remembers what it was like to be afraid of the dark, that there were no answers anyone was going to find. Not answers we could live with. I put in my resignation 3 weeks later. Told them it was family stuff. The ranch needed more attention than I could give while working full-time. That was true enough. What I didn't tell them was that I'd started hearing things at night. Voices, faint and rhythmic, coming from somewhere below the house, coming from the ground itself. The ranch sits on an old coal mine, abandoned since the 20s. Nobody's been down there in decades. Nobody should be down there. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the world is quiet, I hear them. voices underneath, singing something old and patient and hungry. And sometimes when I look out the window toward the hills, I see a figure walking along the fence line, steady gait, mechanical, walking towards something I can't see, walking home. I didn't sleep much those first few weeks after quitting. I told myself it was just nerves, the kind of leftover adrenaline that sticks with you after too many bad winters and worse calls. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid to close my eyes. The voices under the floorboards weren't constant. God, I wish they had been. Predictable things can be lived with, but these came in pulses, in waves, as if something deep below was shifting its weight. Sometimes it sounded like humming, sometimes like breathing. Once, around 3 a.m, it sounded like my father calling my name from beneath the cellar door. My father's been dead 5 years. I moved a cot into the living room so I wouldn't have to sleep over the basement. I kept a flashlight in my hand all night, like a kid afraid of monsters, except the light didn't make me feel safer. Every time I turned it on, it flickered once, just once, like something was draining the battery. These were brand new lithiums. One night early March, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, snow crunching under a weight too steady to be an animal. I stayed in the dark and watched through the window. The motion sensor light should have come on. It didn't. I saw a silhouette move past the window. Tall, thin, wrong posture, like joints bending where they shouldn't. And then a voice, a whisper through the glass, too close, too soft, like someone speaking inside my ear instead of outside the house. Underneath, I grabbed my sidearm out of instinct, even though I wasn't a deputy anymore. I racked the slide, moved toward the door, and counted to 3 before yanking it open. Nothing. No footprints except my own old ones. No figure. But the wind had changed direction, and the smell swept in. Cold rot, thawing flesh. The same smell that came off Earl. I almost slammed the door shut, but something else made me freeze. Out by the fence line, maybe 50 yards away, a shape was standing perfectly still. Could have been a person. Could have been a post. Hard to tell in the dark. But then it moved. A single step, then another. Same gait, same pace. Walking the same direction Earl had walked that night, toward the hills. I should have gone inside, locked the door, called someone, anyone. But instead I followed. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see it up close. Needed proof I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe I thought if I followed it far enough, I'd find something I could explain away. Tracks, a lost hunter, anything. I crossed the field, boots sinking in deep snow, breath fogging in front of me. The figure stayed ahead, always just far enough that I couldn't make out its face. Every time I thought I was gaining, it would shift a little farther. Never fast, never rushed, just steady. It led me toward the northern tree line, toward the entrance of the old mine I hadn't thought about in years. That mine had been boarded up since the 20s. My grandfather told me stories about cave-ins, about men buried alive, about tunnels that went deeper than anyone mapped out. He used to say the mountain was hollow in ways no one understood. When I reached the slope leading down to the entrance, the figure finally stopped. I could see it clearly now. It wasn't Earl, not fully, but it wore his shape the way a shadow wears a person's outline. A voice echoed from the dark behind it, low, rhythmic, familiar. More voices answered from deeper in the mine. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all humming in unison. Cold washed over me, colder than the February air had ever been. The smell hit next. Rot, damp earth, old coal dust. The figure turned its head toward me, slow and creaking, like rusted hinges. "You're late," it said. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even trying to be human. Then it stepped aside. Down in the black of the mine shaft, maybe 30 feet in, I saw them, shapes moving, crawling, clinging to the walls like insects, some upright, some twisted, some wearing faces I recognized from obituary photos, and all of them staring at me. I stumbled backward, slipped, nearly fell. My flashlight flickered, dimmed, then died outright. The only light left was the moon behind me, and it didn't reach far into the mine. But I could hear the movement, the shuffling, the whispered chant of underneath blending with voices calling my name. I ran. I don't remember deciding to. I don't remember half the sprint back across that field. All I remember is the sense of movement behind me, as if a tide of bodies was following. Close enough that I could feel their cold breath on my neck, but never close enough to touch. I didn't stop until I was inside the house with the door bolted and every light on. The voices followed, faint at first, then stronger. Not from outside, from below, from the basement, from the mine tunnels that ran beneath the ranch for miles. I moved out the next day, packed what I could fit in the truck, and left the rest. Haven't been back since. But the part that keeps me up at night isn't what I saw. It's what I realized afterward. Those tunnels don't just run under my ranch. They run under the highway, under the town, under the hills, under everything. And sometimes when the wind shifts just right, when I'm driving at night with the radio low, I hear a voice through the floorboard of my truck. Not Earl, not my father. Something older. And always the same single word, below. Story 4, the name's Curtis Bellamy, 51 years old, been with the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office down in Louisiana for 23 years. Before that, I did a stint as a deckhand on the shrimp boats out of Dulac, back when there was still money in it, and before the hurricanes started coming every other year like clockwork. I grew up in the marsh, learned to pull a pirogue before I learned to ride a bicycle, and I thought I understood what kind of things lived in the water, and what kind of things lived in the stories old folks told to keep children from wandering too far into the cypress. The night I'm about to tell you happened 3 summers ago. August, the kind of heat that sits on your chest like a wet towel and doesn't let up even after midnight. I was working a double because Deputy Arsenault's wife had just had twins and everyone was covering his shifts without complaint. The call came in around 0215 hours from a crabber named Remy Thibodeau, who worked the waters out near Lake Boudreaux. Dispatch that night was Delphine Soileau, been with the department since before I started, voice so calm she could talk down a hurricane. Remy was reporting lights in the old Fontenot place, a fishing camp that had been abandoned since Rita took out half of it back in 2005. Said the lights were moving around inside, flickering like lanterns, and he'd heard what sounded like a party going on. Music, voices, laughter. Problem was, Remy had passed by that camp earlier in the evening, and it had been dark and silent as a tomb. No boats at the dock, no vehicles on the shell road that led out there. Nothing. I radioed that I was responding, took the department's airboat since the roads out to Fontenot's had washed away years ago, and the only way in was by water. The night was moonless and thick with humidity, fog sitting on the bayou like something alive, and I had to run my spotlight just to see the channel markers. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and the water was black as oil, reflecting nothing. Took me about 40 minutes to reach the Fontenot camp. I cut the engine about 100 yards out and let momentum carry me in, listening. At first there was nothing, just the usual chorus of frogs and insects, and the occasional splash of something moving through the water. Then I heard it. Music. Old music, scratchy like it was coming from a phonograph. The kind of Cajun waltz my grandmother used to dance it to when I was small. And underneath the music, voices. Laughing, talking, the clink of glasses. The sounds of a party that had no business happening in a camp that had been rotting into the swamp for almost 20 years. I tied off the airboat at what was left of the dock, drew my weapon, and announced myself. Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office. Come out with your hands visible. The music stopped, not faded, not wound down, stopped, like someone had lifted the needle off a record. The voices went silent, the laughter cut off mid-breath, and then there was nothing but the frogs and the water and my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I cleared the dock, moved up the weathered planks toward the camp. My flashlight cut through the fog and showed me walls that were half collapsed, screens rusted through, a roof that sagged in the middle like a broken spine. No lights inside, no sign anyone had been there in years. I swept the interior through a gap in the wall Saw nothing but rotted furniture and debris and a floor that had partially given way to the water underneath. Nobody could have been having a party in there. The structure couldn't have supported the weight of more than one person, if that. I was about to radio Delphine that the scene was unfounded when I heard footsteps on the dock behind me. Heavy, deliberate, the creak of old boards underweight. I spun around, flashlight and weapon up, and there was a man standing at the end of the dock. He was dressed in clothes that belonged to another century, suspenders and a collarless shirt, work boots that were caked with mud. His face was in shadow, but I could see he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile you see on something that's been waiting a long time and finally got what it wanted. I ordered him to show his hands, identify himself. He didn't move, just stood there, swaying slightly like he was keeping time to music only he could hear. Then he spoke, and his voice was wrong. Too many voices layered on top of each other, like a chorus trying to speak in unison and not quite managing it. He said my mother's maiden name, Trusclair. Said it like a greeting, like he knew me, like he'd been expecting me. My mother died when I was 12, drowned in the marsh during a storm, body never recovered. Nobody talks about the Trusclair family anymore. Most of them are gone, scattered or dead. And the ones who are left don't speak of the old days. I kept my weapon trained on him and asked who he was. He laughed, that same wrong chorus of voices, and took a step toward me. The dock should have creaked under his weight, but it didn't make a sound. He moved like something gliding, something that wasn't quite touching the boards. He said I should ask my mother, said she was down there in the water, waiting. Said they were all waiting. I fired, center mass, 2 rounds, the reports echoing across the water and sending birds screaming up from the cypress. The man didn't flinch, didn't fall, just stood there still smiling, and then he was gone. Not walked away, not dove into the water. Gone, like he'd never been there at all. I stood on that dock for a long time, hands shaking, weapon still raised. Then I searched. Every inch of that camp, every foot of shoreline, every shadow the fog would let me see. Nothing. No blood, no body, no footprints in the mud except my own. I radioed Delphine and told her I'd discharged my weapon, needed backup and a supervisor. She asked if I was injured. I couldn't answer that question honestly. Deputy Landry arrived about an hour later, took his own airboat out from Chauvin. Good man, 10 years younger than me, not superstitious at all, the kind of cop who believes in evidence and procedure and nothing else. We searched together until dawn started graying the sky. Found nothing. My rounds had hit the far wall of the camp, buried themselves in rotted wood. No indication they'd passed through anything on the way. The official report says I responded to a trespassing call, found the property abandoned, discharged my weapon at what I believed to be a threat that turned out to be a shadow or a trick of the fog. Justified use of force, no further action required. That's what the paper says. What the paper doesn't say is what Landry found when we were packing up to leave. A photograph, half buried in the mud, at the edge of the water, laminated against the elements. He handed it to me without a word. The photo showed a group of people standing on that same dock, dressed in old clothes, smiling at the camera. The date written on the back was August 1927, and standing at the end of the dock, same position where I'd seen the man, was a figure I recognized. Same clothes, same smile, and standing next to him, holding his arm like they were sweethearts at a church social, was a young woman with my mother's face. I still have that photograph, keep it in a lockbox in my closet. Haven't looked at it in 2 years. Sometimes at night, when the humidity's high and the fog rolls in off the bayou, I hear music drifting across the water. Old music, scratchy and distant. And I know better than to go looking for where it's coming from. Story 5. My name is Patricia Weaver. I'm 46 years old, and I spent 14 years as a deputy with the Blaine County Sheriff's Office in central Montana before I handed in my badge. The country up there is big and empty and beautiful in a way that can break your heart if you let it. Rolling prairie and the Little Rocky Mountains and sky that goes on forever. I grew up in Chinook, left for Missoula when I was 18 to get a degree I never finished. Came back at 25 because the land gets in your blood and won't let go. The night I'm going to tell you about was October 4 years ago, right around the time the weather starts to turn mean and the ranchers start bringing their cattle in close. The call came in at 22:47 hours from a woman named Vera Sanderson, lived alone on a place about 30 miles north of town, almost to the Canadian border. Vera was 78 years old, tough as rawhide, had been running that ranch by herself since her husband Frank passed in 2011. She reported someone knocking on her door. Not unusual in itself, except for the time of night and the fact that her nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and Vera hadn't seen headlights coming up her road. She said the knocking had been going on for almost an hour. Steady, rhythmic, same pattern over and over. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. She hadn't opened the door, hadn't responded. Just sat in her living room with her late husband's shotgun across her lap and called us. Dispatch that night was a guy named Charlie Whitehorse, former Army medic, steady as they come. He patched Vera through to me while I drove, kept her talking, kept her calm. I told her I was 15 minutes out, told her to stay away from the windows, told her not to open that door under any circumstances. She said she knew better than that. Said she'd lived in this country long enough to know that some things that knock don't deserve an answer. The drive out to Vera's place took me through open prairie, no lights except my headlights and the stars overhead. The moon was a thin sliver, barely enough to see by, and the grass on either side of the road moved in waves like something was running through it, just out of sight. I've driven that road 100 times, and it never bothered me before. That night, it felt like driving through a tunnel with no end. I pulled up to Vera's place at 23:09 hours, killed my engine, sat for a minute listening. Nothing. No knocking, no movement, just the wind and the creak of the windmill by the barn. Vera's house was dark except for a single light in the living room. I radioed Charlie that I was on scene, requested he stay on the line with Vera until I cleared the property. I approached the front door, flashlight in one hand, other hand on my weapon. Standard procedure. Called out, identified myself. Vera's voice came from inside, thin and relieved, telling me the door was unlocked. I entered, swept the room, found her sitting in an armchair with a shotgun still in her lap. She looked pale, older than I'd ever seen her, and her hands were shaking so hard the gun rattled. She told me the knocking had stopped about 5 minutes before I arrived. Said it just stopped, mid-knock, like whoever was doing it had heard my car coming up the road. I asked her if she'd seen anything through the windows. She shook her head, said she'd kept the curtains drawn like I told her. But she said she'd heard something else while she was waiting. A voice, a man's voice coming from right outside the door, asking to be let in, saying her name, saying, "Please, Vera, it's cold out here. Just let me in." The voice, she said, sounded like Frank, her husband Frank, who'd been dead for over a decade. I told her to stay put, told her I was going to check the exterior. She grabbed my arm, stronger than I would have expected from a woman her age, and told me not to go out there. Told me some things wear familiar faces, but aren't what they pretend to be. I said I understood, said I'd be careful, and went out anyway. That's the job. You go toward the thing everyone else runs from. The exterior of the house showed nothing unusual at first. No footprints in the dirt near the door, no disturbance around the windows. The wind had picked up, cold enough to cut through my jacket, and the grass was moving in patterns that didn't quite match the direction the wind was blowing. I circled around to the back of the house, sweeping my flashlight across the yard, and that's when I saw the barn door standing open. Vera kept that barn locked, always. Hadn't kept animals in it for years, just used it for storage. But she kept it locked because she said it felt wrong to leave it open. Said Frank had always insisted on keeping it locked at night. I radioed Charlie, told him I was checking an outbuilding, told him to keep Vera on the line. Then I approached the barn. The interior was dark in a way my flashlight couldn't quite penetrate, like the shadows were thicker than they should have been. I cleared the doorway, swept left and right, standard procedure. Nothing. Just old equipment and hay bales and the smell of dust and age. I was about to back out when I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere above me. I raised my flashlight toward the hayloft. And there was a man standing up there looking down at me. He was wearing clothes that were decades out of style, work shirt and dungarees, boots caked with mud that had dried and cracked. His face was in shadow, but I could see his eyes. They caught my flashlight beam and reflected it back like an animal's eyes. That same flat shine you see in deer or coyotes when you catch them in your headlights. I ordered him to come down, show his hands, identify himself. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there swaying slightly watching me. Then he smiled, and the smile was wrong. Too wide, too many teeth. He opened his mouth and spoke in a voice that crackled like old radio static. And he said, "Patricia, you should go home now. This isn't your concern." He knew my name. I hadn't given my name. I drew my weapon, ordered him down again. He laughed, a sound like gravel being poured into a metal bucket. And then he stepped off the edge of the loft. Didn't jump, didn't fall, stepped like he was walking down stairs that weren't there. One step, then another, descending through empty air until his feet touched the barn floor maybe 10 yards in front of me. I fired. 3 rounds, center mass, the reports deafening in the enclosed space. He didn't flinch, didn't bleed, just stood there, still smiling. And then he started walking toward me. Not fast, not aggressive, just walking, steady and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. I ran, not proud of it, but I ran. Out of the barn, across the yard, back to my vehicle. I got in, locked the doors, started the engine, and radioed Charlie that I needed immediate backup. Shots fired. Officer in danger. He asked for details. I couldn't give him any that made sense. I sat in that vehicle for 40 minutes, waiting for backup, watching the barn through my windshield. The door was still open. I never saw him come out. When Deputy Morrison arrived from Chinook, we searched together. The barn was empty. My rounds had hit the far wall, buried in old wood. No blood, no body, no sign anyone had been in there except the footprints in the dust on the loft floor. Footprints that ended at the edge where he'd stepped off. No prints on the floor below. Nothing to show how he got down or where he went. Vera refused to stay in her house that night. Morrison drove her to her sister's place in Havre, and I stayed on scene until dawn doing a full property search. Found nothing. The official report lists the incident as a trespassing complaint. One suspect fled on foot, rounds discharged with no contact. Unfounded. What the report doesn't include is what Vera told me before Morrison drove her away. She said she'd seen that man before. Once the night Frank died, he'd been standing at the foot of their bed, smiling that same wide smile, and Frank had died in his sleep an hour later. Heart attack, the coroner said. Natural causes. But Vera had known. She'd known it wasn't natural. She'd known something had come to collect, and she'd been waiting ever since for it to come back. I transferred to Great Falls 6 months later, took a desk job with the Highway Patrol. I don't work nights anymore. I don't drive those empty roads under those big skies, because I know what's out there now, waiting in the dark, wearing familiar faces, knocking on doors, and I know that someday it's going to come knocking for me. Story 6. I'm Jerome Acosta, 34 years old. Was with the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Office down in the boot heel of New Mexico for 7 years before I quit. That's the part of the state nobody thinks about. The part where Mexico's just a line on a map and the desert goes on forever, and the only towns are places that used to be something and aren't anymore. I grew up in Lordsburg, moved to Animas after high school to work on my uncle's cattle operation, ended up wearing a badge because the county needed bodies and I needed a paycheck. The night I'm going to tell you about was last spring, March, when the wind comes off the desert like it's trying to sandblast everything back to bedrock. The call came in at 0147 hours from a Border Patrol agent named Gutierrez. Good guy. I'd worked with him on a few smuggling cases. He was reporting something he couldn't explain. Said he'd been running patrol along the fence line about 20 miles south of Animas when he'd seen lights in the old Hachita cemetery. Not flashlights, not headlights. Lights that moved wrong, floating about 3 feet off the ground, drifting between the headstones. He'd approached to investigate and the lights had gone out. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. But when he'd swept the cemetery with his spotlight, he'd found a woman standing among the graves, standing perfectly still, wearing a white dress, staring at him. She hadn't responded to his commands, hadn't moved when he approached. Then she turned and walked into the desert, and Gutierrez had lost sight of her almost immediately. Couldn't explain how. She'd just been there and then she wasn't. Dispatch that night was a woman named Rosario Medina. Been with the department since I was in diapers. Voice like smoke, impatience. She'd logged Gutierrez's call as a possible 1096 mental subject. But something in her tone told me she didn't quite believe that. I was the only unit in the area, so I took the call. Told Rosario I'd check in when I arrived. The drive out to Hachita took me through some of the emptiest country in the lower 48. No lights, no houses, just creosote and mesquite, and the occasional javelina caught in my headlights. The cemetery sat on a rise about a mile outside what was left of the town, maybe 200 graves dating back to the 1890s, most of them unmarked. I'd been there before, during the day, chasing reports of vandalism that never panned out. At night, it was a different place entirely. I parked at the edge of the cemetery road and killed my lights. Sat for a minute, letting my eyes adjust. The moon was half full, bright enough to see the headstones casting shadows across the sand. No lights, no movement. Gutierrez had pulled back to the highway per protocol, waiting for local backup before approaching again. I radioed Rosario that I was on scene, then grabbed my flashlight and started walking. The wind had died down, which was unusual for that time of year. The air was still and cold and heavy with the smell of dust and something else. Something organic, like flowers left too long in a vase. I swept the cemetery methodically, checking behind headstones, looking for footprints or disturbances. Found nothing for the first few minutes. Then I reached the older section, the part where the wooden crosses had rotted away and the only markers were stones too weathered to read. She was standing at the far edge of the cemetery, right where the graves ended and the desert began. White dress, dark hair, barefoot. She was facing away from me, looking out at the desert like she was waiting for something. I announced myself, standard procedure. Hidalgo County Sheriff's Office, ma'am. I need you to turn around and show me your hands. She turned, slowly, deliberately, like she was moving through water. Her face was young, maybe early 20s, and beautiful in a way that felt wrong. Too perfect, too symmetrical, like a mask of a face rather than the real thing. Her eyes were dark and empty, and when she looked at me, I felt something cold settle in my chest. She said my grandmother's name, Consuelo, said it like a prayer, like a curse, like a question. My grandmother died before I was born. Nobody talks about her. My mother told me once that Consuelo had been a curandera, a healer, and that she'd known things she shouldn't have known and done things no one could explain. But she'd never told me more than that, and I'd never asked. I kept my weapon holstered, but my hand was on the grip, thumb on the retention strap. I asked the woman who she was, what she was doing out here. She smiled, and the smile didn't reach her eyes. She said she was waiting, said they'd been waiting a long time. Said the blood remembered even when the mind forgot. I asked her to explain what that meant. She didn't answer. Just turned and started walking toward the desert. Same steady pace Gutierrez had described. I followed, keeping my distance, radioing Rosario to let her know I was pursuing a subject on foot. She acknowledged, told me Gutierrez was en route as backup. The woman walked maybe 50 yards into the desert, then stopped. I stopped too, maintaining distance. She turned to face me again, and this time her face was different. Older, harder, the same features but aged by decades. Skin weathered and cracked, eyes sunk deep in their sockets. She opened her mouth and spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underground, from somewhere deep beneath the sand. She said the old words still had power. Said my grandmother had known that, had used that, had paid the price for it. Said the debt passed down through blood, and I was carrying something I didn't understand. Something that was owed. The wind came back all at once, hard enough to make me stagger, carrying sand that stung my face and hands. I shielded my eyes, and when I looked again, the woman was gone. Just gone. Footprints in the sand that ended abruptly, like she'd stepped off the edge of the world. Gutierrez arrived 10 minutes later. We searched together, following the footprints until they stopped, then fanning out in widening circles. Found nothing. No sign of the woman, no indication where she'd gone. The footprints just ended, clear as day, in the middle of open desert with no cover for hundreds of yards in any direction. I filed my report as a suspicious person, unable to locate. Standard language for something you can't explain. Gutierrez filed his the same way. We never talked about it afterward. Not directly, but sometimes when we'd see each other at the gas station in Animas, he'd give me a look that said he remembered. 3 weeks later, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photograph, old and faded, showing a woman in a white dress standing in front of a wooden cross. The cross was in Hachita Cemetery. I recognized the shape of the hills behind it. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were 2 words in Spanish: La Deuda, the debt. I started asking questions after that. Talked to my mother, talked to my aunts, talked to anyone old enough to remember my grandmother. Most of them wouldn't say anything, but one aunt, my father's sister, told me a story. She said Consuelo had made a bargain once, a long time ago, to save the life of someone she loved. Said she'd promised something in return and never paid it. Said debts like that don't disappear. They just wait. I don't know what my grandmother promised or to whom. I don't know what was expected in return, but I know I don't sleep well anymore. I know I see things in the corner of my eye, shapes that aren't there when I turn to look. And I know that sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I see a woman in white standing at the side of the road. Just standing there, watching, waiting for something she was promised a long time ago. I handed in my badge 6 months after that night in the cemetery, moved to Albuquerque, got a job with a private security company, tried to put as much distance between me and that desert as I could. But you can't outrun blood. You can't outrun what you owe. I know that now. I'm just waiting to find out when the collection comes due. Retreat Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. I thought moving to Albuquerque would help me forget, but the desert has a way of holding on to you, dragging pieces of you with it, no matter how far you run. At first, the city noise helped. Sirens, traffic, people laughing outside bars at 2 a.m. All of it made the silence easier to ignore. But the quiet always comes back. It waits until you're alone in a parking structure or sitting in your apartment at dawn when the sky turns that pale bruise color. That was when the dream started. In every dream, I'm back in Hachita Cemetery. The same half moon, the same windless cold. The woman in white stands among the graves, but she's not looking at me this time. She's staring down at something half buried in the sand. A wooden box, old, handmade. She whispers something in a language I don't recognize, and then she looks at me with eyes that don't blink and says, "You are the one who carries it now." I always wake up before she opens the box. 2 months into my new job, I had my first real incident. I'd been working an overnight patrol at a warehouse complex near I-25. My partner that night was a kid named Lucas, fresh out of the academy, eager, talkative. Around 0300, we split up to check the perimeter. My radio crackled with static. Nothing unusual for that part of the city, but then I heard something underneath the static. A voice, a woman's voice, whispering my grandmother's name. Consuelo. I froze. The wind went still. The security lights dimmed like something had passed in front of them. I called for Lucas, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He answered immediately, cheerful, unaware of anything strange. Nothing on his end, he said. No interference. I swept the perimeter again, slower this time. Then I saw her, standing near the chain-link fence at the edge of the property. White dress, bare feet, hair blowing in a breeze I couldn't feel. She was watching me through the fence like she'd been waiting for me to turn around. I drew my flashlight, hands shaking before I even turned it on. The beam cut across the yard and she vanished. Not walked away, not stepped into darkness. Gone like a candle snuffed out. I should have reported it. Should have told Lucas. Should have called APD and said someone might be trespassing. But I didn't. I knew this wasn't something police would find. This wasn't something anyone could find unless it wanted to be found. For the next week, small things happened, things I kept trying to ignore. My bedroom door opening by itself in the middle of the night. My phone ringing with no caller ID and nothing but breathing on the other end. The photo of my grandmother falling off the dresser, no matter where I put it. Then the package came. Left outside my apartment door with no name, no address. Just my full name written in careful block letters. Inside was a newspaper's clipping from 1961. A girl in a white dress found wandering in the desert near the Mexican border. No memory, no identification. Witnesses described her as calm, beautiful, and strangely unbothered by the cold. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had circled a sentence in red ink. Witnesses reported she repeated one word before disappearing again. Consuelo. My grandmother would have been 18 that year. That night I drove out of the city without thinking. South toward the desert, toward Lordsburg, toward the places I told myself I'd never see again. I didn't stop until I was 20 miles outside Hatcheta, sitting on the side of the highway with my hands shaking on the wheel. The desert was black and empty and endless, but not quiet. I heard footsteps in the sand. Not animal, not wind, human, slow, deliberate, coming from behind my cruiser, walking straight toward me. I locked the doors, breath fogging the inside of the glass. The footsteps stopped inches from my window. When I forced myself to look, she was there, the woman in white, moonlight turning her eyes into dark hollows. She raised her hand and pressed her palm to the glass. Her mouth moved. No sound. Then she pointed to the desert behind her, to a place where the sand formed a shallow dip, like something buried beneath it had shifted. She mouthed two words, "It's yours." Then she was gone. Blink once, she's there. Blink twice, nothing but sand. I sat there for almost an hour, staring at the dip in the desert, knowing exactly what she meant, knowing exactly what she wanted me to dig up, knowing it wouldn't matter if I drove away. The debt wasn't tied to Hatcheta, it was tied to me. I didn't dig, I drove. But the dip in the sand hasn't left my mind. It shows up in my dreams, shows up when I close my eyes, shows up when I look at any stretch of desert too long, and sometimes late at night when the city goes still and the streets empty out, I hear footsteps outside my apartment. Slow, deliberate, patient. And I know one day I'm going to have to go back to that place, to the place where my grandmother made her bargain, to the place where something has been waiting for decades, waiting for me, waiting for what I owe.